Looking around at the wreckage of well-intentioned policies over the past century, one cannot help but notice a pattern. The grand schemes to remake society through rational planning, from urban renewal projects that destroyed communities to educational reforms that abandoned proven methods, have consistently produced results opposite to their stated intentions. This isn't mere bad luck or poor execution. It represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of human society itself. Those of us who have observed political life for decades recognize that the impulse to apply abstract principles to complex human arrangements invariably leads to what I call the politics of the felt need, an approach that mistakes the complexity of social life for a technical problem awaiting expert solution. The question isn't whether good intentions matter, but whether intentions alone can substitute for the accumulated wisdom embedded in our inherited practices and traditions. Chapter 1: The Fatal Conceit of Rational Planning. The rationalist approach to politics begins with what appears to be a reasonable premise, that human reason can identify problems in society and devise solutions to fix them. This seems so obviously sensible that questioning it feels almost perverse. Yet observe what happens when this principle encounters the reality of human experience. Take the urban planning experiments of the mid-20th century, where experts armed with theories about optimal living arrangements bulldozed thriving neighborhoods to create sterile housing projects that became centers of social dysfunction within a generation. The rationalist planner sees a slum and imagines replacing it with orderly towers surrounded by green space. What he cannot see, because it exists as what I call tacit knowledge, are the invisible networks of mutual aid, the informal economies, the social bonds that made that seemingly chaotic neighborhood a functioning community. The grandmother who watches children while mothers work, the corner shop that extends credit during hard times, the informal systems of reputation and trust that regulate behavior, none of these appear on the architect's blueprint because they cannot be reduced to technical specifications. This is not an argument against all change or improvement. Rather, it's recognition that the kind of knowledge required to govern human affairs successfully cannot be captured in abstract formulas. The knowledge of how to live together, how to maintain social order, how to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving what is valuable, this knowledge exists not in textbooks but in the lived experience of communities. It accumulates slowly through generations of trial and error, success and failure, accommodation and adjustment. The rationalist's error lies in believing that this accumulated wisdom can be replaced by expert analysis. He sees tradition as mere prejudice to be overcome rather than as a repository of solutions to problems he hasn't yet learned to recognize. The result is predictable: solutions that create new problems, interventions that destroy more than they repair, and a growing gap between the planner's intentions and the lived reality of those subject to their schemes. The rationalist approach to politics begins with what appears to be a reasonable premise, that human reason can identify problems in society and devise solutions to fix them. This seems so obviously sensible that questioning it feels almost perverse. Yet observe what happens when this principle encounters the reality of human experience. Take the urban planning experiments of the mid-20th century, where experts armed with theories about optimal living arrangements bulldozed thriving neighborhoods to create sterile housing projects that became centers of social dysfunction within a generation. The rationalist planner sees a slum and imagines replacing it with orderly towers surrounded by green space. What he cannot see, because it exists as what I call tacit knowledge, are the invisible networks of mutual aid, the informal economies, the social bonds that made that seemingly chaotic neighborhood a functioning community. The grandmother who watches children while mothers work, the corner shop that extends credit during hard times, the informal systems of reputation and trust that regulate behavior, none of these appear on the architect's blueprint because they cannot be reduced to technical specifications. Consider the deeper philosophical error at work here. The rationalist assumes that because something can be analyzed, it can be reconstructed. But human communities are not machines that can be disassembled and rebuilt according to improved designs. They are more like languages, complex systems of meaning and practice that emerge organically over time. Just as you cannot improve English by eliminating its irregularities and creating a more logical grammar, you cannot improve a community by replacing its organic development with rational planning. This is not an argument against all change or improvement. Rather, it's recognition that the kind of knowledge required to govern human affairs successfully cannot be captured in abstract formulas. The knowledge of how to live together, how to maintain social order, how to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving what is valuable, this knowledge exists not in textbooks but in the lived experience of communities. It accumulates slowly through generations of trial and error, success and failure, accommodation and adjustment. The rationalist's error lies in believing that this accumulated wisdom can be replaced by expert analysis. He sees tradition as mere prejudice to be overcome rather than as a repository of solutions to problems he hasn't yet learned to recognize. The result is predictable: solutions that create new problems, interventions that destroy more than they repair, and a growing gap between the planner's intentions and the lived reality of those subject to their schemes. This pattern repeats itself across domains because it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of social knowledge itself. Chapter 2: The Wisdom Hidden in Apparent Chaos. What the rational planner mistakes for chaos or inefficiency often represents a kind of order that emerges from the bottom up rather than being imposed from the top down. Consider the development of common law compared to comprehensive legal codes. The rationalist mind prefers the elegance of a systematic code where all possibilities are anticipated and provided for. Yet experience shows us that common law, growing organically through the accumulation of judicial decisions responding to actual cases, proves more adaptable and more just in practice. The difference lies in the kind of knowledge each system embodies. A legal code represents the knowledge of its drafters at a particular moment in time. Common law represents the accumulated wisdom of countless judges and legal practitioners encountering real situations over centuries. When new circumstances arise, the code must be amended through cumbersome legislative processes. Common law adapts naturally through analogical reasoning and precedent. This same pattern appears in economic life. The rationalist sees the apparently chaotic operation of a free market and imagines improving it through comprehensive planning. He fails to recognize that the price system, emerging from millions of individual decisions, conveys information about relative scarcity and demand that no central planner could possibly collect and process. The Soviet experiment demonstrated this conclusively. The more comprehensive the planning, the more distorted the allocation of resources and the lower the standard of living. Traditional practices often embody solutions to problems that their practitioners cannot fully articulate. The farmer who follows traditional crop rotation may not understand the biochemistry of soil nutrients, but his practices preserve soil fertility in ways that pure scientific agriculture initially neglected. The merchant who relies on reputation and personal relationships may seem inefficient compared to impersonal market mechanisms, yet his approach proves more resilient during times of uncertainty. This is why I have always insisted that political activity is more like cooking than engineering. The good cook knows that a recipe is at best a rough guide. Success depends on adjusting to the particular ingredients at hand, the humidity of the day, the temperament of the oven. The political equivalent of following a recipe too rigidly is the kind of ideological thinking that sacrifices practical wisdom to theoretical consistency. The wise statesman, like the good cook, develops a feel for the activity that cannot be reduced to explicit rules but proves its worth in practice. Chapter 3: Why Experts Cannot Solve Political Problems. The great seduction of our age lies in believing that political problems are essentially technical problems awaiting expert solution. This confusion arises naturally in a civilization that has achieved remarkable success through scientific and technological methods. If we can put men on the moon and cure diseases that once decimated populations, surely we can apply similar rational methods to eliminate poverty, crime, and social conflict. The appeal of this thinking is obvious, but it rests on a category mistake that leads inevitably to disappointment and often to disaster. Political problems are not technical problems because politics is not a science but an art. The surgeon operates on a patient whose anatomy and physiology conform to scientific laws that apply universally. The politician must navigate a world of human motivations, cultural differences, conflicting interests, and unintended consequences that resist systematic prediction or control. When the surgeon removes an appendix, he need not consider whether the appendix has feelings about the operation or whether other organs will form a coalition to resist the procedure. Consider how this confusion manifests in practice. Educational reformers armed with theories about optimal learning processes redesign school curricula without considering how their innovations will interact with existing school cultures, parental expectations, or student populations different from those studied in the research. The result is a constant cycle of reform and counter-reform as each new theory collides with realities its proponents fail to anticipate. Take a moment to observe this pattern in your own experience. How often have you seen well-intentioned policies produce precisely the opposite of their intended effects? Rent control laws designed to help tenants that reduced the supply of affordable housing. Drug prohibition meant to reduce addiction that creates black markets and increases violence. Welfare programs intended to help the poor that trap families in cycles of dependency. Each represents the same fundamental error, treating complex social phenomena as if they were simple technical problems. The expert's knowledge, however genuine within its proper domain, becomes dangerous when applied beyond its limits. The economist who understands market mechanisms may know nothing about the social bonds that make markets possible. The psychologist who can predict individual behavior in controlled settings may have no insight into how policies will affect the moral fabric of communities. The educator who masters pedagogical techniques may remain ignorant of the cultural transmission that makes education meaningful. This is not anti-intellectualism but rather a recognition that different kinds of problems require different kinds of knowledge. Political wisdom cannot be acquired through academic study alone but only through participation in political life, just as you cannot learn to swim by reading about hydrodynamics. The kind of judgment required for political activity develops through experience, observation, and reflection on the consequences of past actions. Chapter 4: The Education of Political Judgment. The confusion between technical knowledge and political wisdom becomes most apparent in how we prepare people for public life. Modern universities, seduced by the prestige of scientific method, increasingly treat political science as if it were indeed a science capable of producing experts who can engineer social outcomes. Students learn theories and models, memorize case studies, and master analytical techniques, but they rarely encounter what I call the conversation of mankind, the ongoing dialogue between different traditions of thought about how human beings should live together. True political education is not professional training but liberal learning. It involves encountering the great minds who have wrestled with enduring questions of justice, authority, freedom, and order. The student who reads Aristotle's analysis of different constitutional forms learns not techniques for manipulating political systems but ways of thinking about the relationship between political arrangements and human flourishing. Burke's reflections on the French Revolution offer not a blueprint for conservatism but an example of how to think about the relationship between reason and tradition, change and continuity. This kind of education cultivates judgment rather than expertise. Judgment cannot be programmed into policies or procedures because it involves the ability to recognize what is appropriate in particular circumstances. The person of good political judgment can distinguish between necessary reforms and dangerous innovations, between principles worth preserving and practices that have outlived their usefulness, between the demands of justice and the requirements of stability. Consider the difference between a policy analyst and a statesman. The analyst applies general principles to specific cases, seeking consistency and logical coherence. The statesman must balance competing goods, navigate between conflicting interests, and accept responsibility for outcomes that can never be fully predicted or controlled. The analyst deals in certainties. The statesman operates in a world of probabilities and ambiguities. American political life suffers from having too many analysts and too few statesmen. We produce graduates who can calculate costs and benefits but cannot sense the mood of a community, who can design institutions on paper but cannot understand how they will actually function in practice. They mistake information for knowledge and knowledge for wisdom. The cultivation of political judgment requires what universities increasingly neglect: sustained engagement with tradition. Not tradition as dead dogma to be memorized, but tradition as living conversation to be joined. The American constitutional tradition, for example, represents the accumulated wisdom of generations who have wrestled with questions of how to maintain ordered liberty in a diverse society. Understanding this tradition means more than knowing constitutional law. It means appreciating the tensions and trade-offs that the founders navigated and that each generation must navigate anew. Chapter 5: The Paradox of Freedom and Planning. Here lies perhaps the deepest irony of social engineering. The more comprehensively we attempt to plan for human flourishing, the more we undermine the conditions that make flourishing possible. This paradox becomes clear when we consider the relationship between freedom and spontaneous order. Human beings flourish not when their lives are organized according to rational plans, but when they are free to pursue their own purposes within a framework of stable expectations and reliable institutions. Think about this carefully in your own life. The most meaningful achievements, deep friendships, successful marriages, fulfilling careers, creative endeavors, cannot be programmed or mandated. They emerge through the complex interplay of choice, circumstance, effort, and what we might call providence. The parent who attempts to plan every aspect of a child's development often produces anxiety and rebellion rather than excellence. The same principle applies to society as a whole. The American experiment in self-government was founded on recognition of this paradox. The founders created a framework for political life but deliberately left large spaces for individual initiative and spontaneous association. They understood that diversity and vitality require what we might call benign neglect, areas of life where people are free to make their own mistakes and discover their own solutions. This is why federalism and the separation of powers were not merely technical arrangements but philosophical commitments to limiting the scope of centralized planning. Yet each generation faces the temptation to use political power to solve problems that politics cannot solve. We see inequality and imagine that government programs can create equality of outcome. We see moral confusion and attempt to mandate virtue through legislation. We see cultural conflict and seek to impose unity through national policies. Each attempt enlarges the scope of political authority while diminishing the space for the kind of spontaneous cooperation that actually creates prosperity, civility, and meaning. The welfare state represents the institutionalization of this confusion. Beginning with genuine compassion for those unable to care for themselves, it expanded into a comprehensive system that attempts to plan for every contingency of human existence. The result has been not greater security but greater dependency, not stronger communities but weaker families, not more effective help for the truly needy but bureaucratic systems that often harm those they purport to serve. This is not an argument for callousness towards suffering or indifference to injustice. Rather, it is recognition that the desire to help can become a form of tyranny when it seeks to replace personal responsibility and voluntary association with centralized administration. The most effective forms of mutual aid have always emerged spontaneously from shared commitments and local knowledge rather than from abstract principles applied universally. Freedom requires accepting that we cannot guarantee outcomes, only opportunities. The society that attempts to eliminate all risk and uncertainty eliminates the conditions under which human beings develop character, initiative, and the capacity for genuine achievement. Chapter 6: The Unintended Consequences of Good Intentions. Perhaps no phenomenon better illustrates the failure of rationalist politics than the consistent gap between intentions and results in social policy. Time and again, programs designed to help the disadvantaged have trapped them in cycles of dependency. Regulations meant to protect workers have priced them out of employment. Laws intended to promote equality have created new forms of discrimination. This pattern is so consistent that we must conclude it represents not mere implementation failures but something deeper, a fundamental misunderstanding of how human societies actually function. The rationalist assumes that human behavior can be shaped through incentives and disincentives as straightforward as those that govern physical processes. Raise the minimum wage and workers will earn more. Provide free housing and families will be more stable. Expand educational opportunities and inequality will decrease. But human beings are not passive objects of manipulation. They respond to policies in ways that often subvert their intended purposes. Consider the phenomenon of moral hazard in welfare systems. Programs designed to provide temporary assistance during emergencies become permanent ways of life when they reduce the costs of behaviors that create dependency. The mother who receives greater benefits for having additional children out of wedlock faces incentives that undermine family formation. The worker who loses benefits by earning too much faces effective tax rates that discourage initiative. The community that expects government to solve its problems loses the capacity for self-help that makes communities resilient. These are not failures of implementation but logical consequences of treating complex social phenomena as technical problems. The policy maker who focuses only on immediate, measurable outcomes fails to consider how his interventions affect the informal institutions, family, neighborhood, church, voluntary association, that actually shape character and behavior. He optimizes for short-term relief while destroying long-term capacity for self-governance. The drug war provides another instructive example. Prohibition was intended to reduce drug use by making drugs more expensive and harder to obtain. In practice, it created black markets that concentrated enormous profits in the hands of criminal organizations while corrupting law enforcement and filling prisons with nonviolent offenders. The attempt to eliminate drug use through force has produced outcomes, violence, corruption, mass incarceration, far worse than the original problem. This pattern repeats itself because rationalist thinking focuses on direct effects while ignoring systemic consequences. The rationalist sees a problem and designs a solution without considering how that solution will interact with existing institutions, change people's incentives, or create new problems that may be worse than the original difficulty. He thinks in terms of mechanical causation rather than organic development. What makes this particularly tragic is that many of these policies are supported by people of genuine goodwill who simply want to help those who are suffering. Their compassion is real, but their methods are counterproductive because they misunderstand the nature of the phenomena they seek to address. Poverty, addiction, family breakdown, educational failure, these are not technical problems awaiting expert solutions but complex social realities that emerge from countless individual choices interacting with cultural institutions over time. Chapter 7: Toward Practical Wisdom in American Politics. How then should we approach the genuine problems that face American society? Not through comprehensive plans or systematic reforms, but through what I call the politics of prudence, careful attention to particular circumstances, respect for existing institutions, and willingness to make incremental adjustments based on observed consequences rather than theoretical predictions. This approach requires intellectual humility and what Burke called a disposition to preserve and an ability to improve. The prudent statesman begins not with abstract principles but with intimate knowledge of the society he serves. He understands that American political institutions develop through particular historical experiences and embody practical wisdom about how to maintain ordered liberty in a diverse society. The Constitution is not perfect, but it represents the accumulated experience of people wrestling with real problems over centuries. Changes should be made carefully, with full appreciation for why existing arrangements developed as they did. Consider how this approach would differ from current practice. Instead of comprehensive healthcare reform designed by experts and imposed uniformly across the nation, we might encourage experimentation by states and voluntary associations, allowing successful innovations to spread organically while failures remain localized. Instead of federal education standards developed by bureaucrats, we might trust local communities to adapt proven methods to their particular circumstances. This requires recovering what Americans once understood, that the best government is often the government that governs least, not from indifference to human welfare but from recognition that most of the activities that make life meaningful occur outside the sphere of politics. Family life, religious practice, economic exchange, cultural creation, voluntary association, these human activities flourish when protected from political interference rather than when subjected to political direction. The American tradition of limited government was not based on selfishness or lack of compassion but on practical wisdom about the conditions under which human beings flourish. The founders understood that concentrating power in the hands of even well-intentioned officials creates temptations for abuse and reduces the space for individual initiative and voluntary cooperation. They preferred a system of checks and balances, federalism, and individual rights not because they distrusted democracy but because they understood its limitations. Recovering this wisdom requires what I have called throughout my life a conservative disposition, not blind resistance to change but thoughtful attention to what is worth preserving amid necessary adaptations. The conservative understands that human achievements are fragile and that much of what makes civilization possible exists as tacit knowledge embedded in institutions and practices that can be destroyed more easily than they can be created. This does not mean fatalistic acceptance of injustice or indifference to suffering. Rather, it means approaching reforms with the kind of care that a good doctor brings to a complex patient: careful diagnosis, attention to overall health, preference for minimal intervention, and willingness to accept that some problems cannot be solved but only managed. The politics of prudence seeks to alleviate suffering without destroying the institutions that make human flourishing possible. Conclusion. The disasters of social engineering that litter the landscape of modern politics were not unpredictable accidents but logical consequences of a fundamental confusion about the nature of political life. When we treat politics as applied science rather than practical art, when we mistake technical knowledge for political wisdom, when we imagine that human societies can be redesigned according to rational plans, we set ourselves up for the kind of failures we have witnessed repeatedly over the past century. The antidote to this rationalist hubris is not anti-intellectualism but intellectual humility, recognition that the kind of knowledge required for political life cannot be captured in abstract theories but exists only in the lived experience of communities wrestling with the enduring challenges of human coexistence. Perhaps Americans, with their traditional skepticism of grand schemes and their preference for practical solutions, are particularly well positioned to recover this wisdom. The conversation of mankind continues, and each generation must learn anew the delicate art of preserving what is valuable while adapting to changing circumstances. This is the permanent task of political life, and no expert can do it for us.